Some gifts are so small that the world barely notices them until they quietly change someone's life forever. The grand ballroom overlooking downtown Chicago shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers as business leaders, philanthropists, and public officials gathered for one of the city's most prestigious charity galas. Waiters moved gracefully between elegantly dressed guests carrying silver trays filled with sparkling water and carefully prepared appetizers, while a string quartet filled the room with gentle music. At the center of the stage stood Victoria Hayes, a 36-year-old billionaire chief executive officer admired across the country for transforming struggling companies into remarkable success stories. Her tailored cream evening gown reflected the warm lights above as she concluded a heartfelt speech about giving back to communities and creating opportunities for future generations. The audience rose together in a standing ovation. Cameras flashed from every direction, and applause echoed across the magnificent ballroom. Yet beneath her composed smile rested a quiet loneliness that no magazine interview or financial achievement had ever managed to erase. Near the back of the room, 39-year-old Ethan Brooks waited patiently beside his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. His navy blazer had been carefully pressed, although its sleeves showed the gentle wear of many years. He had accepted an invitation from the community center where he volunteered every weekend, never imagining that this elegant evening would become the most unforgettable moment of his life. Lily held a tiny blue gift box wrapped with simple white ribbon against her chest with both hands. She had insisted on bringing it herself after spending several evenings weaving a small bracelet from blue and white thread. Ethan glanced down at her with a gentle smile and quietly asked whether she still wanted to give her handmade gift to the famous guest of honor. Lily nodded without hesitation. She softly replied that sometimes grown-ups looked happy even when their hearts still missed someone. Ethan looked at her with quiet surprise before gently squeezing her shoulder, realizing once again that children often notice truths adults overlooked. As guests slowly returned to their seats, and the evening host thanked everyone for supporting local charities, Lily slipped away from her father and walked carefully toward the stage. Conversations gradually faded as curious eyes followed the little girl crossing the polished marble floor. Security personnel exchanged uncertain glances, but Victoria immediately noticed the child approaching with sincere determination and raised her hand slightly, signaling everyone to allow her forward. Lily stopped only a few feet away and looked up with an innocent smile. Without fear or hesitation, she offered the tiny blue gift box and softly explained that she had made something because she thought everyone deserved to remember someone who loved them. The enormous ballroom became unexpectedly quiet. Victoria accepted the little box with polite gratitude, assuming it contained another thoughtful keepsake from a supporter. Slowly, she untied the white ribbon and opened the lid. Resting inside was a delicate handmade bracelet woven from blue and white thread beside a small folded note written in careful childlike handwriting that simply read, "I hope this helps your heart smile again." Victoria gently lifted the bracelet into the light, and in that instant, every sound inside the ballroom seemed to disappear. The weaving pattern was nearly identical to the bracelets her late father had taught her to make during quiet summer afternoons decades earlier. Her fingers trembled as forgotten memories rushed back with overwhelming clarity, carrying the scent of fresh grass, the warmth of sunshine, and the comforting laughter of the one person she had missed every single day since childhood. Tears quietly filled her blue eyes before she could stop them. She pressed the tiny bracelet against her heart, lowered her head, and silently wept. Hundreds of guests watched in complete silence, unable to understand why the most powerful woman in the room had been moved beyond words by the smallest gift anyone had brought that evening. The ballroom remained unusually quiet for several long moments before gentle applause slowly returned. Not because anyone had been instructed to clap, but because every person present sensed they had witnessed something far more valuable than another successful charity speech. Victoria Hayes carefully slipped the handmade bracelet onto her wrist without taking her eyes off the tiny strands of blue in white thread. She thanked Lily with a voice softened by emotion before kneeling to the little girl's height and asking where she had learned to make something so beautiful. Lily smiled innocently and pointed toward her father, standing respectfully near the back of the room. She explained that her dad had shown her how to braid the threads because he always said gifts made with love lasted much longer than expensive things bought in stores. Victoria slowly lifted her eyes toward Ethan Brooks. He offered nothing more than a humble nod and a warm smile, appearing almost uncomfortable with the unexpected attention now surrounding him. Before she could speak further, another guest politely approached for photographs, interviews, and congratulatory conversations, gently pulling Victoria back into the responsibilities of the evening. Yet throughout every handshake and every carefully rehearsed conversation, her fingers repeatedly found the bracelet resting around her wrist, as though reassuring herself it was real. Hours later, after the final guest had departed and the ballroom lights had begun to dim, Victoria quietly sat alone inside the back seat of her waiting car overlooking the Chicago skyline. The chauffeur asked whether she wished to return home, but she remained silent for another minute while carefully unfolding the little handwritten note once again. She read the simple sentence over and over until tears returned unexpectedly. It had been years since anyone had offered her something that expected absolutely nothing in return. The following Monday morning, the towering glass headquarters of Hayes Global Investments returned to its familiar rhythm of board meetings, financial presentations, and ambitious expansion plans. Senior executives discussed quarterly earnings while advisors reviewed international acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Victoria listened respectfully, yet her thoughts repeatedly drifted back to the little girl with the blue gift box and the quiet father who had stood contentedly in the background. During a short break between meetings, she called her longtime executive assistant into her office. Instead of requesting financial reports or market analysis, she asked a question that surprised everyone. She wanted to know whether anyone could identify the father and daughter from the charity gala. Her assistant promised to look into the matter using the guest registration records and information provided by the event organizers. 2 days later, a simple folder rested quietly on Victoria's desk. Inside, she found only a few pages. Ethan Brooks, 39 years old, widowed several years earlier, raising his 8-year-old daughter alone, employed as a maintenance technician during the week, and volunteering nearly every Saturday at a neighborhood community center without receiving compensation. There were no awards, no newspaper headlines, and no social media campaigns celebrating his kindness. Instead, there were brief notes from local organizers describing how he repaired broken furniture, mentored children, delivered donated groceries to elderly neighbors, and always refused public recognition. Victoria slowly closed the folder and looked once more at the bracelet resting against her wrist. She had spent most of her adult life surrounded by influential people whose generosity often arrived accompanied by cameras, announcements, and carefully prepared speeches. Yet this quiet father had somehow raised a daughter who believed the greatest gift anyone could offer was hope wrapped in simple thread and genuine love. Looking through the floor-to-ceiling windows toward the busy streets far below, Victoria realized that despite all her success, she knew almost nothing about the kind of life that produced such quiet dignity. For the first time in many years, she found herself longing not for another business victory, but for the chance to understand the extraordinary, ordinary man whose greatest achievement was not building a fortune, but raising a child whose kindness had reached a heart that billions of dollars never could. 3 days after reading the report about Ethan Brooks, Victoria Hayes found herself returning to the tiny blue gift box far more often than she returned to the financial reports stacked across her polished desk. Late one quiet evening, after the final executive had left the office and the city lights shimmered beneath her floor-to-ceiling windows, she carefully opened the box once more. As she gently lifted the bracelet, something small caught her attention. Tucked beneath the soft lining rested a tiny pressed white daisy she had not noticed before. She carefully held the delicate flower between her fingers, and another forgotten memory quietly surfaced. When she was a little girl, her father had once placed a pressed daisy inside one of her favorite storybooks after telling her that the most beautiful things in life rarely lasted forever unless someone chose to preserve them with love. The memory arrived so vividly that she could almost hear his warm laughter carried by a gentle summer breeze. Victoria slowly closed her eyes as tears gathered once again. For years, she had believed success could protect her from loneliness. But in that quiet office, she finally admitted to herself that no achievement had ever filled the empty place her father's absence had left behind. Across the city, life continued very differently for Ethan and Lily. Their modest home echoed with simple routines that never changed. Ethan prepared homemade pancakes on Saturday morning, while Lily sat at the kitchen table weaving another bracelet from colorful thread she had purchased with a few dollars saved from helping organize donated books at the community center. She proudly held up the unfinished bracelet and asked her father whether famous people ever kept handmade gifts. Ethan smiled gently while placing fresh strawberries onto her plate. He explained that people often forgot expensive presents, but gifts carrying genuine love had a way of remaining in someone's heart forever. Lily nodded thoughtfully and quietly continued weaving each strand with patient care. Later that afternoon, father and daughter walked together toward the neighborhood community center where volunteers were preparing weekend activities for local children. Ethan repaired a loose bookshelf, helped arrange folding tables, and greeted every family with the same calm kindness that had become part of his everyday life. Lily spent the afternoon reading stories to younger children before joining several volunteers in planting colorful flowers near the entrance. Neither of them imagined that someone was quietly watching from a parked car across the street. Victoria had driven there alone without informing anyone from her company. She wore a simple cream sweater, blue jeans, comfortable sneakers, and no jewelry except the handmade bracelet that had not left her wrist since the gala. Sitting behind the steering wheel, she watched Ethan laughing with neighborhood children, patiently fixing broken toys, and thanking every volunteer as though each person had done something extraordinary. There were no cameras, no reporters, and no influential guests. There was only ordinary kindness repeated so consistently that it had become the natural language of the entire community. Victoria realized she had spent years searching for meaning in places where admiration was measured by titles and wealth, while this quiet father seemed to create hope simply by showing up every weekend with open hands and a grateful heart. As the afternoon sunlight slowly settled across the flower beds, Victoria made a quiet decision that surprised even herself. Next Saturday, she would return to the community center, not as a billionaire chief executive officer, not as a public figure, and not as a donor. She would come simply as another volunteer, hoping that somewhere between repaired bookshelves, shared conversations, and ordinary acts of kindness, she might finally rediscover the part of herself that had been waiting patiently to come home. The following Saturday arrived beneath a clear blue Chicago sky, carrying the kind of gentle warmth that invited neighbors outdoors long before noon. Victoria Hayes parked several blocks away from the community center instead of using the entrance closest to the building. She wanted nothing about her arrival to draw attention. Wearing a simple cream sweater, comfortable blue jeans, white sneakers, and the familiar handmade bracelet resting quietly around her wrist, she walked toward the modest brick building carrying only a small canvas bag filled with gardening gloves and bottled water. The sounds of children laughing drifted through the open windows while volunteers greeted one another like old friends. For a brief moment, Victoria hesitated near the entrance, suddenly feeling more nervous than she had ever felt before speaking to thousands of investors. Ethan Brooks noticed her standing outside and walked over with his usual warm smile. He welcomed her exactly as he welcomed every new volunteer, thanked her for coming, and handed her a simple name tag with only one word written across the front, Victoria. There were no curious questions about her career, no special treatment, and no recognition of her public reputation. To Ethan, she was simply another person willing to help. That unexpected simplicity immediately eased the nervousness she had carried through the morning. Lily spotted Victoria only seconds later and hurried across the room with bright excitement shining across her face. She looked first at the bracelet and then at Victoria's smile before asking the question that had been waiting inside her heart since the charity gala. She softly asked whether she still liked the little bracelet. Victoria gently touched the woven threads around her wrist and answered with complete honesty that she had not taken it off for a single day. Lily smiled proudly before taking Victoria by the hand and leading her toward the arts and crafts tables where younger children were coloring pictures and building small wooden birdhouses. Throughout the morning, Victoria helped organize books, cleaned shelves, served snacks, folded donated clothing, and painted flower pots alongside volunteers whose names she had never heard before that day. No one asked how much money she had. No one cared what company she led. They simply laughed together, solved small problems together, and celebrated every finished task, no matter how ordinary it seemed. During lunch, everyone gathered around folding tables covered with homemade casseroles, fresh fruit, sandwiches, and lemonade prepared by neighborhood families. Ethan thanked each volunteer individually before encouraging everyone to enjoy the meal. Victoria quietly watched as he made certain every child received food first. Every elderly guest had a comfortable chair, and every volunteer felt appreciated. His kindness was never dramatic. It appeared in dozens of small decisions repeated so consistently that they had become part of his character. Later that afternoon, while they worked together repairing an old bookshelf inside the children's reading room, Victoria asked Ethan why he devoted nearly every weekend to a place that could never repay him. Ethan paused for a moment before smiling gently. He explained that people had helped him after his wife passed away, and one day he realized the greatest way to honor that kindness was to pass it forward instead of trying to repay it backward. He quietly added that dignity grew stronger whenever ordinary people chose to care for one another without expecting recognition. Victoria lowered her eyes toward the bracelet resting beside the sleeve of her sweater and felt those words settle deeply inside her heart. For years, she had searched for extraordinary answers to life's greatest questions. Yet this quiet father seemed to carry them naturally within the way he lived every ordinary day. As the afternoon sunlight filled the reading room and children's laughter echoed softly through the hallway, Victoria realized that no boardroom, luxury office, or financial success had ever given her the peaceful sense of belonging she had discovered in a single day among people who valued character far more than status. The Saturdays that followed slowly became the brightest part of Victoria Hayes's week, although no one inside the community center realized how extraordinary that simple change truly was. Every Friday evening, she quietly cleared her calendar, postponed unnecessary meetings, and instructed her office that she would be unavailable until Monday morning. For the first time in years, the woman who had built an empire worth billions looked forward not to business victories, but to sweeping floors, carrying donated boxes, planting flowers, and sharing ordinary conversations with people who expected nothing from her except kindness. Ethan Brooks noticed only that she returned faithfully each weekend with the same warm smile and willing hands. He never asked about her career because it simply did not matter to him. If someone came ready to serve others, that was introduction enough. One cool Saturday afternoon, after several weeks of volunteering together, Ethan climbed a short ladder to inspect the aging roof above the children's reading room. A recent spring rain had left small water stains across one corner of the ceiling. He carefully examined the worn shingles before climbing back down and quietly telling another volunteer that the building would eventually need a new roof, fresh insulation, and repairs to several classrooms. His voice carried no complaint. He simply smiled and said they would continue doing the best they could until the right opportunity arrived. Victoria happened to overhear every word. She looked around the modest building that had already given her more peace than any luxury office she had ever owned. She imagined the children studying beneath a leaking roof and felt a quiet determination settle inside her heart. She knew the cost of restoring the entire community center represented only a tiny fraction of what her company spent furnishing executive offices each year. Yet she also understood Ethan well enough to know he would never feel comfortable accepting help that singled him out or placed anyone above the rest of the community. That evening, after returning home, Victoria contacted the director of her charitable foundation through a secure private call. She instructed the foundation to approve a neighborhood improvement grant for the community center through its regular community development initiative. She made only one request. Her name must never appear anywhere in connection with the donation. No announcements, no photographs, no interviews, and no recognition. She wanted the gift to belong entirely to the community rather than to herself. Several weeks later, construction crews quietly arrived early one Monday morning. Volunteers stared in amazement as workers replaced the damaged roof, repaired classrooms, refreshed faded walls with bright paint, installed new shelves for the children's library, restored the playground equipment, and planted beautiful flowers around the entrance. Parents smiled with relief, while children watched excitedly through classroom windows as the building slowly transformed into a place that reflected the hope already living inside it. Ethan gathered everyone together that Saturday and explained that an anonymous community development grant had made the improvements possible. He encouraged the volunteers to remember that some of the greatest acts of generosity happened when no one knew whom to thank. Standing quietly near the back of the room with a paintbrush still in her hand, Victoria lowered her eyes and smiled softly. She realized she had never experienced such deep happiness from giving because this time there were no headlines, no applause, and no expectations waiting afterward. The miracle did not end with the renovation. Inspired by the anonymous kindness, retired neighbors donated handmade curtains for the classrooms. Local restaurants began providing weekend lunches. High school students volunteered to tutor younger children after school, and neighborhood gardeners filled every flower bed with colorful blossoms. Watching the growing wave of generosity, Ethan quietly told Lily that kindness always traveled farther than anyone expected when it was given without asking for anything in return. Lily looked around the joyful community before gently squeezing her father's hand and smiling toward Victoria without saying a single word. Victoria smiled back, touching the handmade bracelet resting beside her watch, and understood that one tiny gift from a little girl had quietly become the beginning of countless miracles that no amount of money alone could ever have created. By the time spring reached its fullest bloom, the community center no longer looked like a forgotten neighborhood building. Bright flowers lined the entrance. Freshly painted classrooms welcomed children each morning, and every repaired corner reflected the quiet generosity that had made the transformation possible. Yet the greatest change had never happened inside the walls. It had happened inside the people who gathered there every weekend. Victoria Hayes continued arriving without an announcement, wearing comfortable clothes instead of elegant business attire, and carrying boxes of books or gardening tools instead of expensive handbags. She had gradually become part of the community without ever asking for a place within it. The children greeted her by name, elderly volunteers saved her favorite seat during lunch, and neighborhood families smiled whenever she walked through the front door. Ethan Brooks never treated her differently from anyone else. If tables needed moving, they carried them together. If shelves needed organizing, they worked side by side. If children wanted another story before going home, they each took turns reading aloud. The simplicity of those ordinary Saturdays slowly became the happiest routine either of them had known in years. As April drew to a close, preparations began for the annual spring family celebration, a tradition that brought together every family connected to the community center. Volunteers decorated the activity hall with colorful paper flowers, handmade banners, and children's artwork, while folding tables filled with homemade casseroles, fresh fruit, cookies, and lemonade stretched from one end of the room to the other. Ethan spent the morning adjusting the sound system and arranging chairs for grandparents, while Lily practiced a simple song with several younger children who had been nervous about performing in front of an audience. Victoria quietly helped decorate the stage, carefully hanging bright ribbons and placing fresh flowers along the front, while laughing with children who proudly showed her their painted butterflies and colorful drawings. By late afternoon, the room overflowed with joyful conversations, warm applause, and the comforting sounds of neighbors celebrating one another instead of themselves. After the children's performance ended, Lily quietly disappeared behind the stage for a brief moment before returning with a carefully folded drawing held gently against her chest. She walked directly toward Victoria, who immediately knelt to meet her at eye level with the same warm smile she had worn every Saturday since first arriving at the center. Without saying anything at first, Lily placed the drawing into Victoria's hands. Victoria slowly unfolded the paper and felt her heart stop for a moment. The picture showed three smiling figures standing together outside the community center beneath a bright blue sky. Ethan stood on one side, wearing his familiar denim shirt. Lily smiled brightly in the middle while holding both hands, and Victoria stood beside them with a handmade bracelet clearly drawn around her wrist. Above the picture, written carefully in large childlike letters, were the simple words, "Thank you for being part of our family." Victoria stared silently at the drawing as tears slowly filled her blue eyes once again. She had accepted prestigious awards before thousands of people, signed business agreements worth unimaginable sums, and received praise from world leaders. Yet nothing had ever reached her heart the way a single piece of paper covered in crayons had. Ethan quietly walked over after noticing the emotion on her face. Looking at the drawing, he smiled gently before softly explaining that Lily only included people she trusted completely in pictures of her family. Victoria looked from the drawing to Ethan and then toward the children laughing throughout the beautifully restored hall. In that quiet moment, she understood something she had searched for across countless years of success and accomplishment. Home was never a building, a title, or a fortune. Home was the place where people welcomed one another without conditions, where kindness quietly became belonging, and where one little girl's innocent heart had made room for someone who had believed she would always be alone. As the weeks quietly unfolded into early summer, the renewed community center became more than a neighborhood gathering place. Families from surrounding communities began visiting after hearing about the welcoming atmosphere. Volunteers arrived in greater numbers every weekend, and local businesses quietly donated books, sports, equipment, and fresh food for children's programs. The transformation seemed almost impossible to explain because it had not been created by a marketing campaign or a large public fundraiser. It had grown naturally from one simple truth repeated through countless ordinary acts of kindness. Ethan Brooks continued arriving before sunrise every Saturday, exactly as he always had. He unlocked the front doors, brewed fresh coffee for the volunteers, checked every classroom, watered the flowers surrounding the entrance, and greeted every person with the same genuine smile that made strangers feel immediately welcome. Nothing about his routine changed simply because more people now admired the community center. Recognition had never been the reason he served, and he refused to let attention become his purpose. Victoria Hayes admired that quiet consistency more with every passing week. She continued volunteering without revealing her identity, finding greater satisfaction in stacking books beside Ethan or helping children complete art projects than she had ever found inside luxurious boardrooms. One Friday afternoon, a producer from a respected Chicago television station contacted the community center after hearing remarkable stories about the neighborhood's revival. The station wanted to film a feature highlighting how ordinary volunteers had inspired extraordinary change. Everyone welcomed the opportunity because they hoped additional attention might encourage even more families to become involved. Victoria politely spoke with the producer before filming began and gently explained that she preferred not to appear on camera because the story belonged to the community rather than to any individual. The producer immediately respected her request. The following Saturday, cameras quietly captured children reading together, volunteers preparing lunches, elderly neighbors sharing conversations, and families planting flowers around the building. Eventually, one reporter approached Ethan and thanked him for leading such an inspiring transformation. Ethan smiled with his usual humility before gently shaking his head. He explained that no single person had rebuilt the community center. Every repaired bookshelf represented someone who donated time. Every colorful flower reflected someone who cared enough to plant it. Every child's laughter belonged to parents, volunteers, teachers, neighbors, and countless generous hearts working together. He quietly added that kindness became strongest when nobody competed for recognition. The reporter lowered the microphone for a brief moment, visibly moved by the sincerity of his answer. Standing nearby, while organizing donated books, Victoria listened silently. Throughout her business career, she had attended countless ceremonies where successful leaders eagerly accepted praise for achievements built upon the efforts of entire teams. Yet Ethan naturally stepped away from the spotlight without hesitation, lifting everyone else instead of himself. Watching him quietly thank each volunteer after filming ended, she realized that genuine leadership required neither applause nor titles. It simply required character repeated consistently over time. Later that evening, after the television crew packed away its equipment and families slowly returned home, Ethan and Victoria stood together outside the community center watching children race across the playground beneath the soft golden light of the setting sun. Ethan looked toward the joyful scene and quietly remarked that planting kindness was much like planting trees. The person who planted them might never enjoy every moment of shade they created, but someone else always would. Victoria gently touched the handmade bracelet resting around her wrist before smiling toward the neighborhood that had unknowingly restored her heart. For the first time in many years, she understood that the greatest legacy anyone could leave behind was not measured by wealth, influence, or public recognition. It was measured by the quiet hope left inside other people's lives, growing steadily long after the original act of kindness had been forgotten. The television feature aired the following Wednesday evening and quietly touched far more hearts than anyone at the community center had expected. Viewers across Chicago watched children laughing beneath newly restored classrooms, neighbors working side by side, and volunteers serving one another with genuine joy. The story focused not on dramatic moments, but on ordinary kindness repeated faithfully over time. Ethan Brooks appeared only briefly, speaking with the same humble sincerity that had guided every part of his life. When the interviewer asked what had made the community center so different from countless other organizations, Ethan simply smiled and answered that people changed neighborhoods when they stopped asking who deserved kindness and started giving it freely. His words spread quickly through the city because they sounded refreshingly honest in a world often searching for louder voices. The following Saturday, several new families arrived after watching the program, bringing books, school supplies, homemade desserts, and willing hands. Ethan greeted every newcomer exactly as he greeted longtime volunteers, making each person feel that they already belonged. Victoria Hayes watched the growing crowd with quiet gratitude, knowing that the anonymous gift had repaired a building, but Ethan's quiet dignity had rebuilt something far greater. Throughout the busy morning, they worked together assembling shelves inside the expanded reading room, while children eagerly filled every chair with colorful storybooks. During a short break, Lily invited Victoria to join her beneath the large maple tree behind the building where families often gathered for lemonade after volunteer projects ended. The little girl looked thoughtfully at the bracelet still resting around Victoria's wrist before asking a question so gentle that it immediately reached her heart. She wondered whether Victoria still felt lonely sometimes. Victoria remained silent for a moment before answering honestly that she did, although not nearly as often as before. Lily smiled with the quiet confidence only a child could possess. She explained that her father always said loneliness became smaller whenever people allowed others to walk beside them instead of trying to carry everything alone. Victoria looked toward Ethan, who was patiently helping an elderly volunteer load donated chairs into a storage room while laughing warmly at one of the man's old stories. She realized he had never tried to impress her, rescue her, or earn her admiration. He had simply treated her with the same steady respect he offered every person who crossed his path. That quiet consistency had slowly dissolved the wall she had spent years building around her heart. As the afternoon drew to a close, families gathered for an informal picnic on the freshly restored lawn. Children chased bubbles across the grass, while parents shared homemade meals beneath the warm summer sun. Ethan spread a simple checkered blanket for himself and Lily before noticing Victoria preparing to leave. Without hesitation, Lily ran over, gently took Victoria's hand, and invited her to sit with them because, in her words, every picnic was better when friends stayed together. Victoria accepted with a grateful smile and settled onto the blanket beside them. They shared sandwiches, fresh watermelon, and quiet conversation while watching children play beneath the golden light. No promises were spoken. No grand declarations interrupted the peaceful afternoon. Yet as Ethan handed Victoria a glass of fresh lemonade and Lily happily rested against both of them while describing her dreams for the future, each of them quietly recognized the same simple truth. Some relationships did not begin with dramatic moments or carefully planned intentions. They grew patiently through shared kindness, quiet dignity, second chances, and ordinary days until one morning they no longer felt like strangers choosing to spend time together, but like hearts that had gently found their way home without ever realizing the journey had already begun. Summer slowly settled over Chicago, wrapping the neighborhood in long golden evenings and gentle breezes that carried the sounds of children laughing through the streets surrounding the community center. Life continued with the same peaceful rhythm that Ethan Brooks had always treasured. He worked faithfully throughout the week, spent every Saturday serving beside friends who had become like family, and returned home each evening grateful for the quiet life he and Lily shared. Victoria Hayes remained a familiar face among the volunteers, although almost no one outside the community center knew that one of the most successful business leaders in America spent her weekends planting flowers, reading children's books, and serving homemade meals beside ordinary neighbors. She had discovered something more valuable than success. She had discovered belonging. One warm Saturday afternoon, after another joyful volunteer project had come to an end, Ethan, Lily, and Victoria remained behind to help tidy the activity hall. Sunlight streamed through the newly restored windows while the scent of fresh flowers drifted gently inside. Lily sat quietly at one of the craft tables, carefully folding colored paper with complete concentration. After several minutes, she walked toward Ethan and Victoria, holding a small handmade card decorated with tiny blue and white flowers that reminded Victoria of the bracelet she still wore every single day. Lily handed the card to Victoria with a shy smile before stepping back beside her father. Victoria slowly opened it. Inside was a simple drawing showing the three of them standing together beneath the large maple tree behind the community center. Above the picture, Lily had carefully written, "Families are made by love every day." Victoria could no longer hold back the tears that quietly filled her eyes. She looked toward Ethan, who smiled gently without saying a word, understanding that some moments became more meaningful when silence was allowed to speak instead. After a long pause, Victoria softly admitted that she had spent years believing she needed to earn every meaningful relationship through achievement, responsibility, or success. She confessed that after losing her father, she had buried herself in work because building companies felt easier than rebuilding a broken heart. Ethan listened without interruption before quietly telling her that healing rarely arrived all at once. Sometimes it entered through a child's kindness, an ordinary conversation, or a Saturday spent helping strangers who eventually stopped feeling like strangers. He smiled gently and added that the strongest families often began with people choosing one another one ordinary day at a time. Lily reached for both of their hands exactly as though the gesture required no explanation at all. Standing together beneath the warm afternoon sunlight, none of them spoke for several peaceful moments. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt complete. Several weeks later, the community center dedicated a small reading garden behind the building where children could enjoy books beneath the shade of the old maple tree. A modest wooden plaque stood near the entrance with a simple message chosen by the volunteers themselves. It did not mention donations, successful businesses, or individual achievements. It simply read, "Kindness grows wherever someone chooses to share it." Victoria smiled quietly when she read the words, because they perfectly reflected the lesson that had transformed her own life. She never revealed that the anonymous grant had come from her foundation, and Ethan never tried to discover who had provided it. Neither of them needed answers that would have distracted from the greater miracle already standing before them. As another peaceful Saturday came to a close, Ethan, Lily, and Victoria walked home together beneath the soft evening sky, their shadows stretching across the sidewalk while laughter echoed gently behind them from children still playing in the restored garden. Months earlier, everything had begun with a little girl offering a handmade bracelet to a woman carrying invisible sorrow. Now that same tiny gift had quietly become a forever home built not from wealth or grand promises, but from quiet dignity, unwavering kindness, second chances, and three hearts that had finally discovered they had been searching for one another all along.